How do people survive for generations without hospitals, supermarkets, or electricity? The answer is not what you expect. Deep in the Amazon, where rain can fall for days, rivers can swell in a single night, and the canopy hides more life than most continents, 5 very different peoples have learned to live not by conquering the forest, but by listening to it. The hidden truth is not a single secret or a survival hack. It is a way of knowing, an attentive, practiced language of tracks, seasons, plants, songs, and silence that turns an apparently hostile environment into home. Imagine a clearing at dawn. Mist lifts from a braided river of palms, and the air tastes of wet soil and fermenting fruit. The forest hums at a frequency most outsiders miss, a chorus of insects, the distant slap of a caiman's tail, birds rehearsing their territory in overlapping calls. This scale, hundreds of thousands of square miles, layered in microclimates, flooded terraces, and sheer biological complexity, creates hazards that would make a city dweller dizzy. Venomous snakes weave through leaf litter. Malaria-carrying mosquitoes find every hollow. Rivers change course without warning. Yet here, despite those dangers, human communities thrive by translating danger into knowledge. If you want a full deep dive on any of these peoples, let us know in the comments. The first portrait opens with the lightest of traces, the sweep of a footprint, a broken twig, a circle of ash quickly buried. In the south of Colombia, in the flatlands where the green rolls into swamps and river labyrinths, the Nukak move as if the forest itself were an idea to be kept flexible. A temporary camp appears like a punctuation mark in the forest. A few poles set, a pan bowl, the smoke of a small fire. By evening the poles are stripped, the fire's scent rubbed into the ground, and nothing remains but a suggestion in the leaves. They are nomads in the fullest sense. Mobility is not an inconvenience to be fixed, but the technology of survival. Mobility here is a form of resource management. The Nukak do not stay in one place until the soil is spent. They move before that, tracking fruiting trees, monitoring animal trails, and avoiding the accumulation of parasites and pests that come with long occupancy. Moving every few days keeps the forest's resources renewing. Small game can repopulate, trails that attract predators close again, and patches of edible palms and tubers recover. To an outsider, constantly moving looks precarious. To those who practice it, mobility is a calendar, a set of seasonal maps held in memory. Learning to move like this is apprenticeship rather than instruction. Boys follow older hunters, not with a handbook, but by sitting in the shade and watching how hands hold the blowpipe, how a footfall is softened to avoid breaking a twig, how a hunter reads the way a vine hangs to know the direction of a trail. Knowledge is transmitted through example, correction, and repeated exposure to the forest's small cues. Few things are said outright. Most are shown, felt, and repeated until the gestures are indistinguishable from memory. This way of life proved volatile when the forest's borders met modern national borders. In the late 20th century, extended contacts with state agents, settlers, and armed groups changed the Nukak's world in a single, devastating sweep. Disease, respiratory infections, influenza, and other pathogens to which the Nukak had no immunological memory arrived alongside violence and displacement. Communities fractured, roots were abandoned, and many elders who held critical oral knowledge did not survive the contact years. The loss of elders matters not only emotionally but practically. When a storyteller or a master hunter dies, entire chapters of ecological knowledge, where a medicinal root grows, how fast a particular fruit tree regenerates after a flood, can go with them. The Nukak's response to this is not passive nostalgia. In some communities, there are efforts to revitalize movement practices and teach youth in ways that combine traditional apprenticeship with selective formal education, always cautious about how state services reshape social structures. Mobility itself serves as a protective strategy against some modern threats. For example, being sparsely distributed through the landscape makes certain forms of land grabbing more difficult. Yet other pressures are relentless. Extractive industries send roads where there were none, bringing settlers and chainsaws that open up formerly remote corridors. When a logging road cuts through a forest, it is rarely just wood that moves. Pathogens, opportunistic land claims, and new social dynamics move along with it. Farther west, where the forest tilts into foothills and the canopy thickens to an interlocking ceiling, the Huarani inhabit a different ecological theatre. Here, survival frequently depends on the vertical. Life in the understory and the canopy, reading the air and the leaves for the paths of monkeys and birds. The Huarani are known among researchers and neighboring peoples for their exceptional skill with the blowpipe, what outsiders call a zarabatana, paired with curare, a potent plant-derived paralytic applied to darts. These are not weapons of indiscriminate violence. They are sophisticated tools crafted and calibrated by generations of trial, observation, and ritual. A hunting scene with the Huarani is not the cinematic chase one might imagine. It is a choreography of patience and precision. Hunters move silently along game trails, often in pairs or small groups, pausing as if the forest's heartbeat were audible. They carry long, tapered blowpipes, smooth from years of handling. Darts are feathered and weighted, tipped with curare compounds whose preparation is complex. It requires knowledge of vine species, of the heartwood or sap that concentrates alkaloids, of extraction methods that minimize contamination, and of dosages appropriate for target species. The making of curare is both pharmacology and ritual, practical chemistry wrapped in social meaning. Territorial stewardship is woven into Huarani life. Collective decision-making determines hunting zones and contact with outsiders. In their ethos, the forest is not an inert backdrop, but an interlocutor. Trees, animals, and rivers are nodes in networks of obligations. When oil companies encroach, the conflict is not only over land or money, it is a collision of worldviews. One that treats the forest as a reservoir to be tapped, the other as a living field of relations. The arrival of oil exploration in Huarani territories brought contamination and long-term health effects reported by communities across the Amazon. Spills, improper waste pits, and altered waterways affect fish and game, and the chemicals move through food webs into human bodies. At the same time, the presence of extractive companies reshapes social life. Roads and airstrips bring traders, missionaries, and national authorities, and with them new forms of dependence and new vectors of disease. For a people who make territorial boundaries a matter of survival, such incursions create not only ecological damage, but social and spiritual rupture. Despite this, the Huarani have agency and strategy. They negotiate, resist, and adapt. Some communities have leveraged legal systems to assert rights to land titles and to demand environmental cleanup. Others have maintained stricter isolation policies. There are elders and young leaders who combine traditional knowledge with modern advocacy tactics, using maps and legal claims to make the forest legible to a state that prefers lines on paper. When discussing these communities, it is important to note that names and spellings vary in different records. Huarani has appeared as Waorani, and occasionally other forms surface in older texts. Such variance is a reminder to treat ethnonyms carefully and verify sources. North of the Huarani territories, and following the geomorphological spine where rivers meet upland forest, the Matses hold a reputation that has been shaped in part by their extraordinary ethnobotanical memory. An elder among the Matses can name dozens, sometimes hundreds of plants, listing not only where they grow, but how to prepare them, contraindications, and ritual contexts. This is not merely a cataloguing of plants, it is an embodied pharmacopoeia, a living book passed down in stories, songs, and careful demonstration. Picture a Matses elder kneeling beside a low shrub, fingertips brushing leaves as if reading Braille. The plant's scent tells part of the story, a bitter note, a resinous stickiness, aromatics that promise either relief or danger. The elder identifies the species, slices a leaf, and explains its use. A poultice for bites, a decoction for stomach complaints, a smoke used in cleansing rituals. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, a remarkable collaboration turned some of this oral knowledge into a written pharmacopoeia. Researchers, often working alongside Matses healers, compiled plant descriptions and uses into texts intended both to preserve knowledge and to create a bridge to biomedical research. That written record is exceptional, but it is only a fragment of what the elders actually carry. The rules of dosage, the timing of administration, and the ritual protocols that govern when and how a preparation may be used. Among the foods and medicines of the Matses are practices that outsiders might find surprising or alarming, such as rites involving frog secretions used in purification and medicinal contexts. It is vital to stress that these are embedded in ritual systems. They are administered by trained specialists, and they carry risks. They should not be imitated. The presence of such rites illustrates an important point. Traditional medicine here is empirical, yes, but it is also social. Healing is a process that binds individuals to community, and the right to prepare certain remedies is often regulated by lineage, apprenticeship, and ritual sanction. The Matses' encyclopedic knowledge made them visible to the outside world in a way that both preserved and endangered them. When logging roads and colonists appeared, they brought novel pressures. Illegal logging can remove specific plants used in medicine long before a community realizes the loss, because timber species and medicinal shrubs often occupy the same habitats. As trees fall, microhabitats change. Some plants that only thrive under a certain canopy are lost. Colonization also introduced markets that diverted labor and attention from traditional practices to cash cropping or wage work, weakening apprenticeship chains. Across these three portraits, Nukak mobility, Huarani blowpipe stewardship, Matses ethnobotany, one theme repeats itself in different registers. Knowledge is practice. It is encoded in movement, in crafted tools, in songs, and in the hands that make them. Knowledge is not an abstract store, it is a living, practical competence that must be cared for. Where elders die without passing on their roles, where roads shorten migratory circuits, where contamination changes which species are safe to eat, the continuity of that competence frays. The forest itself reveals this truth if one knows how to read shifts in sound and presence. Where agriculture presses into previously forested patches, the chorus changes. Certain insect frequencies fall away, monkey calls thin, and the steady undergrowth of medicinal herbs gives ground to grasses. These are not neutral alterations, they are alterations of an ecological memory that communities rely on. Loss of biodiversity, then, is not only a scientific problem in a laboratory sense, it is a cultural loss because it removes the objects of knowledge and the contexts where that knowledge is taught. When discussing these realities, caution is necessary. Do not mistake reverence for romanticism. These peoples are not living museum pieces. They are active agents making decisions under pressure. Nor is their knowledge a cure-all. Many traditional medicines have clear efficacy for certain conditions, and many are being studied by scientists for their pharmacological potential. But there is no guarantee that a ritual or an herbal preparation will cure every disease. Presenting practices as universally curative would be both inaccurate and dangerous. As the narrative moves east, the forest's economy shifts. In the middle reaches, where rivers widen and floodplains dominate, communities shaped by agroforestry practices have turned the idea of cultivation into a conservation technology. The Ashaninka illustrate this approach with gardens that look at first glance like a managed piece of forest. In an Ashaninka garden, you will find plantings of manioc, plantain, cacao, and tubers intermingled with fruit trees and useful timber species. This polyculture approach maintains soil fertility, supports a diversity of pollinators and game, and ensures year-round yields through staggered harvests. They call these agroforestry systems by various local names, but their logic is consistent: mimic the forest's structure to make agriculture sustainable rather than extractive. Women in Ashaninka communities are often the stewards of these agroforests, combining botanical knowledge with gendered systems of labor and inheritance. They teach their children the timing of planting, how to nurse a young tree through seasons of drought, and how to integrate medicinal and kitchen species. Communal houses, long malokas, serve as living classrooms where songs, rituals, and the rules for planting and harvesting are transmitted. The Ashaninka history of resisting the rubber boom and later conflicts has also shaped a social fabric resilient to disruption. Kinship networks, communal decision-making, and shared labor economies all buffer the community against shocks, at least to some degree. Madam Risk is never absent. The same qualities that make agroforestry sustainable can be eroded by land grabs, monocrop incentives, and policies that favor short-term logging concessions. Additionally, market pressures can encourage communities to shift toward cash crops, which may increase income but also concentrate labor in ways that narrow the webs of knowledge transmission. The social world of seeds, jokes, songs, and stories does not easily travel to a market stall. Further along the riverways, the Shipibo Konibo combine symbolic knowledge and craft to sustain social identity and livelihood. Their kene designs, intricate geometric patterns painted on textiles and bark cloth, are more than decoration. They encode cosmological ideas, clan identities, and sometimes mnemonic devices for songs or stories. A kene may be taught by a master artist, and the motifs are learned in the same slow apprenticeship we have already seen: observation, repetition, correction, and ritual practice. In their ceremonies, curanderos sing Icaros, healing songs that bind plant knowledge to melody, guiding both patient and healer through treatments that are simultaneously herbal and performative. Shipibo Konibo communities are active participants in modern markets as artisans, selling textiles and prints, and their visibility has created both opportunities and ethical dilemmas. Cultural appropriation is a real threat. Patterns and chants move into global markets stripped of context, divorced from the social rules that give them meaning. When kene becomes a fashion motif on a t-shirt in a distant city, the original relationships, the lineage, the rituals, are invisible. Some Shipibo Konibo artists collaborate with ethical buyers to protect designs and ensure fair compensation. Others find their imagery reproduced without consent. Across all 5 portraits, the mechanisms of transmission repeat: apprenticeship, ritual-sanctioned roles, communal living spaces, songs, and a constant, attentive reading of the environment. But what does it mean to say that survival is knowledge? It means that these people's longevity in the Amazon depends less on raw numbers, how many can pack a machete, and more on the depth of a cultural archive. That archive is patterned. It determines when to move and where to set camp, which plants to trust for a fever, how to season blowpipe darts, which songs to sing at a healing, and how to manage plots of land so they replenish rather than erode. And yet that archive is under threat. Elders die, roads arrive, markets demand a different economic logic, and contaminants enter food webs. A single disrupted apprenticeship can create a generational gap that lasts decades. When a master weaver stops teaching kene because her time is taken by market work, the motifs do not vanish overnight. but the subtle meanings and their proper ceremonial uses can become attenuated. When a river is fouled by oil, fish decline, and with them go the stories of seasonal migration and the recipes tied to particular species. When a logging concession slices through a corridor, the microhabitats that sustain medicinal herbs fade. These are not abstract losses. They alter daily life. There is another, quieter danger that travels alongside chainsaws and trucks, appropriation without reciprocity. Knowledge about plants and ritual systems has scientific and commercial value. Pharmaceutical companies and ethnobotanists have sometimes recorded indigenous uses and then patented derivatives without returning benefits to the communities. That process extracts value while eroding the social basis for knowledge transmission. For communities, the question is ethical and practical. Who has the right to record, publish, and profit from this knowledge, and under what conditions? As the shadows lengthen in the middle reaches of the Amazon, another pattern becomes clear. Responses to contact are not uniform. Some communities have sought legal recourse to protect territories and resources. Others have navigated complex trade-offs, accepting some aspects of modernity that improve health or education, while resisting those that fracture cultural continuity. Agency shows up in negotiations, in the choice to teach language in school, in the way a village structures its council. It also shows up in refusal, in communities that prefer limited contact and whose claims deserve particular protection and respect. When discussing isolated groups, an ethical caution is necessary. Never list routes, coordinates, or encourage unauthorized contact. Self-determination includes the right to distance. By the time night covers the canopy, the documentary's threads have traced a map less of location than of technique, movement and stealth, blowpipe mastery, encyclopedic plant knowledge, agroforestry practices, symbolic arts, and songs. Each is adapted to a particular niche of the Amazon's complexity. Taken together, they suggest the hidden truth. Survival here is not a matter of brute force, but of cultivated attention, a social technology that reads the forest's signals and responds. But this is not a tidy conclusion. In many places, the very practices that sustained life are being tested in ways that were unimaginable to elders who grew up before oil rigs and asphalt. For some groups, the immediate crisis is health. Contact-related diseases in the late 20th century decimated communities that had limited prior exposure to certain pathogens. For others, the devastation is ecological. Once a river is polluted, the food chain changes, and the community has to relearn diets and medicines. In still other cases, the threat is cultural, where commodification and intellectual property questions erode the social rules that regulate knowledge. An Ashaninka woman, for example, might show how she grafts a fruit tree into a polyculture plot, explaining in a low voice the ritual rules that guide which species are planted together. Nearby, the hum of machinery from a distant road mutters like a geological fault. In some Matses localities, the act of writing certain pieces of knowledge into books was a protective tactic, an attempt to create material that could survive the death of elders. But a written pharmacopoeia does not capture the songs, the timing, the fasting that once accompanied a remedy. Documentation helps, but it is not a substitute for living tradition. As the camera follows an elder gathering a leaf at dusk, the scene tightens, hands moving with practiced certainty, insects rising in the periphery, and a distant echo, perhaps the sound of a chainsaw or the plane that brings goods to a river airstrip. That sound complicates the scene. It is the arrival of modernity as a spatial pressure, an acoustic intrusion into a rhythm measured in seasons and animal migrations. Here, at this juncture between care and intrusion, the narrative pauses, not for lack of things to say, but because the story's movement requires attention. to the gestures of teaching, and to the forces pressing in. The hidden truth begins to feel urgent. Each practiced hand, each song, each mapped trail is an archive under pressure. If that archive frays, it is not merely a cultural loss, it is a loss of practical techniques that manage biomes and sustain lives on a fragile planet. We leave the immediate accounts at the moment of decision, an elder choosing which seeds to save for the coming season, a hunter deciding whether to accept a payment for guiding a new road, a healer weighing whether to allow a researcher to record a song. These are moments where knowledge, public, private, communal, faces a test. How communities answer will shape not only their futures but ours, because the Amazon is not an isolated reservoir. It is part of a planetary system that regulates climate, hydrology, and biodiversity. There are facts to verify and names that appear with variant spellings across different records. Some ethnonyms have been rendered in multiple ways by outsiders, and dates of first contact are not always consistently reported. These uncertainties underscore a practical guideline for anyone working with this material. Verify the sources, respect community assertions about names and history, and prioritize consent. Above all, avoid revealing information that could put isolated or vulnerable communities at risk. When the next segment opens, the film will move deeper into the Matsei's pharmacopoeia, and then into the Ashaninka's agroforests and Shipibo-Konibo symbolic systems, following the same pattern of scene, technique, transmission, and threat. For now, the motifs have been set. Knowledge as the mechanism of survival, transmitted by practice and under threat from multiple fronts. The question that now presses is both simple and profound. Who will be the next generation of keepers, and what will they have left to learn from? The question that now presses is both simple and profound. Who will be the next generation of keepers, and what will they have left to learn from? In a Matsei's clearing at dusk, the light thins through overlapping leaves, and the air tightens with the wet smell of crushed herbs. An elder bends over a rootstock, not to harvest so much as to teach a set of hands how the root feels when it is ripe. Hard, slightly damp under the soil, with a particular density that separates it from poisonous lookalikes. The scene is small and precise. A child watches the angle of the blade, the length of the cut, the way the elder rinses the sample and tastes a careful smear, not swallowed but spit out. Each gesture carries rules: who may collect at what season, which parts are gathered for children, which require fasting or ceremonial permission before use. That embodied scaffolding is what the written pharmacopoeia captures imperfectly. The Matsei's decision to collaborate on documented plant lists grew out of urgency. When loggers and colonists brought chainsaws and new markets, many elders feared that oral lines would fray. Working with sympathetic researchers, healers agreed to record names and uses, to create a tangible archive that could be consulted even if travel corridors and apprenticeships were broken. Those texts are powerful tools. They make knowledge legible in a bureaucratic world that prizes written proof. They also expose a tension. Writing can protect but cannot reproduce the living contingencies that make medicine effective. Dosage is rarely just a number. It is tied to a patient's weight, the season, the ritual state, and the healer's own intuition. Songs often mark the timing of remedies, and the safety net of a community who will watch a patient during a purge, who will chant while a poultice cools, cannot be captured on a page. The Matsei's illustrate another peril of visibility. When specific plant uses are published, they attract interest from pharmacologists and sometimes opportunistic companies. There are stories across the Amazon of compounds isolated from plants, later patented and commercialized without fair benefit sharing. For communities that have long regulated knowledge through social norms, lineage, apprenticeship, ritual sanction, this legal and commercial extraction undermines the social rules that sustain the knowledge. It is not merely an economic injustice, it is a social fracture. Once knowledge becomes privatized, its communal transmission can be distorted or halted. Matse's elders often balance protection with collaboration. In some communities, healers stipulate strict conditions for outsiders, recordings only with consent, publications that credit and compensate, and protocols ensuring that sensitive rites, those involving potent animal or amphibian secretions, are not disseminated. These are practical safeguards rooted in a social ethic. When a community's council refuses to grant access, that refusal is an exercise of sovereignty. The deliberate choice to keep particular knowledge inside the community, where it is governed by existing relationships. The Ashaninka's response to external pressure has been different in method, but similar in intent. Preserve the practical forms that keep soil, people, and culture intact. Walk through an Ashaninka agroforest, and the effect is obvious. The ground underfoot is dappled with roots and leaf litter, a layered canopy hosts fruit trees, and the air is thick with the hum of pollinators drawn to staggered blooms. The garden is, in effect, an archive of species and relationships, seed systems that store not just genetic material, but recipes for resilience. In one household, a woman may graft a bitter manioc variety onto a stronger rootstock, and then teach a nephew how to recognize when that tree has adapted to a particular microclimate. In another, a group will swap seeds at communal gatherings, accompanied by stories of drought years and how certain varieties withstood them. Ashaninka agroforestry is gendered knowledge in action. Women often steward medicinal and kitchen species, and ritual life reflects this division of labor. The timing of planting may follow a lunar calendar known chiefly to women elders. The protocols for a postpartum garden are taught in whispered gatherings. The long communal houses, the malokas, serve as classrooms where the logic of polyculture is rehearsed alongside myths that encode ecological advice. During community festivals, the songs that accompany planting cycles are not mere ornament. They are mnemonic devices, a way to recall complex sequences, how to nurse a young cacao tree through its first 2 years, when to let a fallow regenerate, which companion plant repels a common pest. Such systems were honed under pressure. The Ashaninka oral histories recall the rubber era, when forced labor and violent expropriation tore social fabrics and drove some techniques to the brink. Surviving those eras produced social structures of mutual aid, extended kin networks, rotation regimes for crops, and labor-sharing practices that buffer shocks. Those same structures, however, are sensitive to market incentives. When cash crops promise quick income, households may convert portions of their polyculture into monocrop fields or sell seeds rather than exchange them. That immediate gain can hollow out the subtle webs of practice that require repeated, patient interaction. Meanwhile, the Shipibo Konibo's cultural economy shows how symbolic systems can both sustain and be commodified. In a riverside studio, an artisan paints kene patterns with a slow, rhythmic hand. The motifs are taught in sequences. First, the base geometry, then the inflections that signal clan identity or stories of origin. Apprentices learn by tracing, overwriting, and repeating. The designs are taught with context, when a pattern is appropriate for a ceremonial cloth, when it marks a healer's lineage, and when it is reserved for a particular ritual. The kene is not merely aesthetic, it is a repository of relational knowledge. Curanderos, the healers, bind song, touch, and plant use into a therapeutic whole. Ikaros, the healing songs, guide the treatment. They can direct a patient's attention, call spirits into a ceremony, or signal the timing for an application. A single Ikaros may contain embedded markers. a melodic phrase that indicates a particular plant's usage or a cadence that aligns with a recommended sequence of treatments. These practices are trained in apprenticeship. A young healer will spend years shadowing a senior curandero, learning songs and the ways they map onto remedies. Market exposure has offered the Shipibo Kunibo both livelihood and threat. Artists sell textiles to tourists and galleries, and some households leverage this income for medicines and education. But once Kane patterns appear on mass-produced goods without permission, the relational integrity dissolves. Patterns become mere visuals, divorced from the ritual rules and responsibilities that once accompanied them. In response, some communities negotiate licensing agreements, develop certification marks, and insist on ethical partners. These measures are part of a broader attempt to translate cultural protocols into forms that the global market can recognize and respect. Across all 5 peoples, apprenticeship is the backbone of transmission, yet the cadence of apprenticeship is changing. Where once a child might spend the majority of daylight hours near an elder, modern schooling and market labor now carve up time differently. Education can be a double-edged sword. Bilingual, culturally grounded schooling can reinforce knowledge and language, while schools that function as assimilationist institutions may sever lines of practice. Several communities have chosen to integrate traditional curricula into classroom settings, teaching Kane geometry alongside mathematics or plant identification alongside biology. These hybrid solutions aim to produce young people literate in both worlds, able to navigate legal claims for territory while sustaining ritual competence. Legal tools feature in the repertoire of responses. Territorial recognition, land titles, and recognition of collective rights provide a buffer, granting communities legal leverage against extractive companies. Participatory mapping, where communities themselves create maps that record sacred sites, migration corridors, and key resources, has proven effective in courts and advocacy spaces. So too have protocols around prior informed consent and benefit sharing become key terms in collaborations with researchers and companies. Yet legal instruments are only as strong as enforcement on the ground. A title without patrol capacity may offer little protection when a logging company moves in or when hunters and settlers cross boundaries. Community documentation projects also offer a pragmatic approach. Audio archives of Icaros, photo catalogues of Kane motifs, seed banks that preserve diverse cultivars, and digital platforms that store medicinal recipes under indigenous governance are all strategies communities employ. Importantly, many insist that such projects be led by the communities themselves or by trusted partners bound to strict ethical codes. Ownership and control over data are central. Who can access recordings? Who can reproduce images? Who benefits financially from a recorded remedy? These questions are not peripheral technicalities. They shape whether documentation strengthens or undermines traditions. The environmental links are unequivocal. When rivers are contaminated by oil, or when mercury from illegal gold mining leaches into fish, the practical knowledge that ties a people to seasonal diets and medicines is disrupted. If a particular fish species dwindles, recipes and preservation techniques tied to that fish risk fading. If medicinal plants decline due to canopy loss, the specific treatments they enable become unavailable, and apprentices have fewer opportunities for learning by practice. These ecological changes feed cultural erosion, and cultural erosion accelerates ecological mismanagement because the people most attuned to local signals are fewer. Threats to knowledge transmission are not only external. Demographic trends, youth migration to cities in search of work, intermarriage with other groups, or changing fertility patterns affect how many potential apprentices a community can support. In some places, youths who leave and return bring back language attrition. In others, they carry hybrid practices that reshape traditions in unpredictable ways. Some communities have adapted by developing intergenerational workshops, summer-intensive apprenticeships, and incentive programs to encourage young people to study traditional arts as viable economic activities. These are experiments in resilience. They assume that knowledge can be stabilized through deliberate social investment. There is also an intellectual and ethical front to this struggle. Indigenous advocates have increasingly reframed the debate around knowledge as one of sovereignty. If a pharmacopoeia is recorded by and for a community, then the community controls the terms of its dissemination and any benefits that arise. International instruments, such as frameworks for traditional knowledge protection and benefit sharing, are imperfect but offer leverage. Local initiatives, including cooperatives and artist collectives, provide practical mechanisms to ensure that craft economies return wealth to makers rather than to intermediaries. Yet none of these responses will succeed if the broader public remains inattentive. The Amazon's functions, regional rainfall regulation, carbon sequestration, biodiversity maintenance, are linked to the very practices these peoples steward. Their agroforests store carbon not because of technology, but because of practice. Multi-layered canopies, permanent soil cover, and tree species choices all reduce erosion and maintain microclimates. Traditional hunting regimes can prevent overharvesting precisely because they embed rules about territorial rotation and seasonal taboos. To lose that knowledge is to lose systems of stewardship that have kept vast tracts of the Amazon functional for centuries. This recognition reframes conservation. It moves the narrative away from a naive opposition, indigenous peoples versus environmental protection, and toward a partnership model where rights and ecological knowledge are central to effective conservation. Protected areas, drawn without the participation of riverine or forest communities, can replicate colonial patterns of exclusion, undermining both justice and ecological effectiveness. Conversely, models that center indigenous stewardship have shown promising results in preserving biodiversity while respecting human livelihoods. Still, there are hard trade-offs. A community may choose to accept a health clinic in exchange for permitting some controlled access to markets. A group may agree to a road that facilitates schooling and emergency medical care while simultaneously increasing the risk of illegal logging. Those decisions belong to communities with agency. The documentary position is not to judge, but to illuminate the stakes. Each choice carries costs and benefits, and the moral frame must respect self-determination. If there is a single organizing insight that the 5 portraits yield, it is this: the forest is a repository of relations that are learned, managed, and transmitted. Knowledge is not a static cache, but a dynamic practice, listening, testing, and adapting. The Nukak's mobility practices teach that not occupying a space permanently can be a high-order conservation strategy. The Huaorani's blowpipe craft demonstrates the refinement of weaponry into a toolset governed by ritual and territorial ethics. The Matsei's pharmacopoeia shows the deep empirical scaffolding of plant knowledge and the dangers of its misappropriation. The Ashaninka model of agroforestry reveals cultivation as a method of maintaining ecological complexity. The Shipibo Konibos, Kene and Ikaros remind us that symbolic systems encode practical guidance on identity, healing and social order. To protect this archive requires multiple overlapping strategies: legal recognition and enforcement, community-led documentation under indigenous governance, ethical research practices grounded in prior informed consent, and equitable benefit sharing. Education systems that integrate traditional curricula and economic models that make cultural practices viable without commodifying them in harmful ways. It also requires a public that listens, less to fetishize the exotic, and more to support the institutions that allow living traditions to continue. There is a practical humility embedded in this approach. No single outside actor, NGO, state or researcher can replace the apprentice who spends 5 seasons learning to read a river for fish migration. External assistance is most effective when it strengthens internal institutions, training local researchers, supporting guard and patrol programs chosen by communities, funding seed banks controlled by elders, and creating market linkages that respect cultural protocols. Conservation that disregards local governance is blind conservation. Research that ignores consent is extractive. Finally, there is an ethical line around knowledge that must not be crossed. Rituals and potent preparations, whether curare, timbo fishing techniques, or amphibian secretions used in purification, carry risks and are embedded in social and ceremonial protocols. Public dissemination of precise instructions would be irresponsible. For vulnerable or isolated groups, even revelations about seasonal camps or preferred hunting corridors can invite harmful contact. The documentary record must therefore balance illumination with protection, showing practices and their context without producing instruction manuals or exposing sensitive data. As night settles over the Amazon, the camera lingers on a scene that gathers the film's themes. An elder presses a seed into the palm of a child and tells, in a low voice, the story of a season. Around them, the sounds of the forest continue. Frogs at the water's edge, insects like a thin rain, a distant motor suggesting a road. But the human moment is intimate. Knowledge is handed across the threshold of touch and story. It is slow work, communal labor, and not easily rushed. Who will be the next generation of keepers? That answer will be written in choices, the decisions families make about time and labor, the ways communities negotiate with external pressures, the extent to which legal systems recognize collective rights, and the willingness of outside actors to listen, to compensate fairly, and to respect the sovereignty of those who live in the forest. Protecting the Amazon's human archives is not a secondary cultural task. It is a central ecological imperative. If this narrative leaves one impression, let it be this: the Amazon's survival depends as much on the continuity of knowledge as on trees alone. When elders are supported, when children learn by shadowing masters, and when communities retain the right to govern their knowledge, the forest and its peoples maintain a resilience that benefits us all. Loss of that knowledge is not a localized tragedy, it is a diminishment of a planetary storehouse of adaptive practices. If this story resonates, consider sharing it with someone who cares about culture and conservation. Subscribe to follow full documentaries that explore these themes in depth and help spread awareness of why listening, really listening, to the forest and to the people who live in it may be one of the most important acts we can undertake. Acknowledgements to communities who have generously shown their lives. Names and spellings used here vary in different records and should be verified with community sources during production. Above all, respect and consent must guide any further engagement.